Hey guys, in today's video we're going to be going over a really complicated and interesting Scrabble endgame that was sent to me by my friend Andy Wong, who's a very strong expert. Now, in this game, his opponent Steve just bingoed with girdles for 90, which was a very nice and surprising play on this tight a board, and Steve has taken a 27-point lead, 342 to 315. Andy's got quite a rack here. He's got both blanks as well as an S, but he's got the clunky UW combo to go with it as well as an A and a P. You can see that the bag is empty and Steve has a full rack of 7 tiles. A-D-E-I-I-N-X. So both players have 7 tiles. Like I said, the bag is empty, so there will be no more tiles drawn. We are fully in the endgame, and it is Andy's turn, and he needs to figure out how, if at all, he can make up 27 points in this position. And spoiler alert, he can, but it's not easy. Before I jump into talking about the winning plan or doing any analysis, I will give you guys an opportunity if you want to pause the video and try to figure out what you would do here or solve the endgame for yourself. For anyone who solved it, big congratulations. Like I said, this is a very challenging endgame, especially with both blanks on your rack and having to navigate all kinds of possibilities, so major props to anybody who got it. And with that said, I will now jump into the analysis. The key issue for Andy in this position is that even though he's got both blanks and the S, it's deceptively difficult for him to score enough points to overtake Steve, especially because Steve has the X and is presumably going to be scoring a decent amount of points with it on his next turn. So an obvious play might be something like paw next to the Y and O in Yod up here, which scores 26 points. It gets rid of Andy's P and his W, and obviously with SU blank blank on his rack, he's going to have many spots to go out on his next turn. So this would put Andy to within a single point of Steve. The problem is Steve has a very nice play with his X. It's a little bit tricky to see, but it is the 5-letter word of axion through the O in Kuid, making the 2-letter words of if and nu down the C column. And this would give Steve 31 points. And the thing is, now Andy is simply down too much. Yes, he does have many outplays here. His best is a pretty cool one. It's down the N column. He can play either Shur or Sura over here, making several insertions. He hooks L to make Ls, and he inserts a U to make lug, a blank R to make air, and a blank A to make say, or if he were to play Shur, a blank E to make C. But this would fall short, because this brings Andy to within 13, and then after he gets 8 more points from Steve's unplayed tiles, Steve would hold on to win by 5, 373 to 368. So playing out with Sura doesn't work, and you might be wondering, well, what if Andy doesn't go out? Steve has DEI left after Axion, and it feels like that should go out easily, but it actually doesn't. There's nowhere for Steve to go out on this board, and that's a good illustration, guys, of just how tight this board is. On the vast majority of endgame boards in Scrabble, DEI would go out at least somewhere. But what Andy could try to do is slow play, meaning not go out immediately, figuring that Steve can't end the game on his next turn, and try to rack up extra points. So maybe something like us over here, holding blank blank, quite a leave, and scoring 24 points. So this would bring Andy to within 8. The problem is Steve can still score pretty well with these tiles. He can play DE on the top left, getting 21 points. And Andy can obviously go out in many, many places, but the thing is, he only has blanks, and blanks are worth 0 points, and he's just not going to be able to score enough. His best out is actually pretty tough to see. It's Ick over here for 14, making Chow and King, and this would fall well short. Steve would hold on to win by 13, 394 to 381. So basically, the moral of the story is, if Andy tries to just go with the obvious scoring play of paw on his first turn, assuming Steve finds his best response of Axion, Andy is going to fall a bit short. So let's now go back to the original position. Instead of paw, what else might Andy think about? One spot I was drawn to when I was trying to solve this endgame myself after Andy sent it to me was the LA on the E column from Palmar and Ogam. I figured maybe Andy could even do something making a blank, a third M with MMM, something like SMU over here, but I pretty quickly realized this wasn't going to work because Andy can't go out with APU. Like I said, it's deceptively difficult to go out on this board with anything but a super flexible rack. We saw even DEI wouldn't go out for Steve after Axion. There just aren't a lot of spots on this board to play multiple tiles. It's really, really constricted and exhausted. So I quickly realized that wasn't going to work, and then I thought about slaw. This seemed like an interesting idea because it sets up stuff like punas, P-U-N-A-S, or pupas on row 12, making one of the blanks an S to hook slaws. And Steve can't really block this, but it unfortunately falls to Axion just as the other option of paw does. Steve, once again, makes this play, and as before, Andy could try slow playing because Steve doesn't have an out, but it's pretty clear that down 37 points, that's not going to help him any more than just going out immediately, and that's going to fall short. Once again, after he gets 8 points from Steve's rack, Andy is going to lose by 6, 367 to 373. So this actually fares 1 point worse than Paw does, which, as we saw before, lost by 5. So let's go back once again now to the original position. We've ruled out Paw, and we've ruled out Slaw. A really stylish play I noticed is Andy can actually play Pinkins through the disconnected ink and N on the board, burning one of his blanks and scoring 23 points. The problem is this doesn't really help him. Steve just plays Axion as before, and Andy's still down 35. Even though he has stuff like Wall and War on his rack, he can't go out, and he can't really score that much with his W's, so this is going to also be an easy win for Steve. So as flashy as that is, that doesn't work. And I also looked at plays under the Z, making something like as, but the problem is that doesn't even score that much, because Andy's only using 1-pointers, and if he plays as, then he has 2 blanks, but he's got PUW to go with it, and it's not too hard to see that he's not going to be able to go out with this rack, so Steve once again would just play Axion and go on to win this game quite comfortably. I also looked at more all-out setup plays. Even plays like Sun and a pawn burning one of the blanks for just 7 points, with the idea of trying to set up a big play on the next turn, like Swaps or Swamp. The problem is, Steve doesn't even have to block this. He can still ignore it with Axion, and yet again, Andy isn't going to get enough. Andy goes out with Swamp, and after getting 8 points from Steve's rack, Steve still wins by 4. So the problem is, these setups just don't score enough. Even with a W and the P, Andy really needs a ton of points to overcome Axion, and he just doesn't seem to be able to get it. The best sequences we've been able to find that are more or less straightforward outs and 2 seem to fall somewhere between like 4 and 8 points short. So going back to the original position, after I realized none of these worked, I was like, okay, probably Andy needs to try to block Axion in some way. But the problem is, it's not easy to do that. Like, he just doesn't have a lot of words to the O in Kuid, and he has to be careful. For instance, if he tries to play something with a P, like Palau over here, then Steve plays Apex for 63 through that P, ending the game immediately. So it's not that easy for him to block. One idea that does jump out, though, is making an insertion play through the second E in Kuid, playing between the letters of Few and Ven. Andy could do something like Ways there, which looks very promising. It scores pretty well, gets him 20 points, it keeps both of his blanks, and most importantly, it blocks Steve's play of Axion, which as we saw was proving very difficult, if not impossible, for Andy to outscore. So this would bring Andy to within 7 points of Steve, and Steve now needs to figure out what he's doing with his X now that he can't play Axion. It turns out there isn't really much better for him to do other than to dump it for 20 points with Lax. And after this, Andy's down 27 points, he's got PU double blank, and Steve still has 6 tiles. He's got ADEIIN. So if we do the math, that adds up to 7 points on Steve's rack. If we multiply that by 2, that's 14 points Andy's going to be getting from the points on Steve's rack. So that would bring Andy to 349, which is 13 away from Steve. So Andy needs to go out for 13 points with PU double blank in order to tie and 14 or more to win. And amazingly, he can't do it. It feels like it shouldn't be that hard to do. But for instance, he could play Startup through this tar on the board. That's only 10, so that would lose by 3. He can play something like Palau or Punto on the top left. That's also only 10. And amazingly, there is no better out. That's how bad this board is, guys. Even with PU and 2 blanks, which makes tons of 4-letter words, there is simply nowhere Andy can go out for more than 10 points. And it's not too hard to see that slow playing isn't going to do Andy any better because Steve has several pretty good scoring threats. He can play Add in the bottom right corner, making Za and Id for quite a lot. He can also play stuff like Aid next to the G in Girdles, making GI and Bid. So Steve has several options that score pretty well. Trying to not go out is only going to do Andy more harm than good, so his best option here would just be to go out for 10 points and lose this game by 3. So we see that Ways, unfortunately, doesn't work either. However, there's a similar idea through that same E that might have a little more promise, and that's to burn one of his 2 blanks by playing Weep, which gets him 2 more points immediately. Ways was 20, Weep is 22, and also by getting rid of the P, Andy might leave himself a little bit more flexibility. He also does leave the S on his rack. So he's only got 1 blank, but he does have the S, and he doesn't have to deal with the P. So let's see what happens after Weep. Now, Steve, of course, again, can't play Axion, and there really isn't anything better to do other than Lax, as we saw before. So now, Andy only needs 11 points instead of 13, right? Because he got 2 more points with Weep than Waze. He's now down 25. We know he's getting 14 after he goes out from the unplayed tiles on Steve's rack. So he needs to get 25 minus 14, which is 11 with this rack to tie, 12 or more to win. And can he do it? He sure can. He can actually get a lot more than that with that same play we were talking about earlier. He can play Sura on the end column here, forming several nice insertions, and that's more than enough. He's going to get the 14 points from Steve's rack and win by a margin of 10 points, 372 to 362. And there's really nothing else Steve can do here other than lax. Steve can technically block Sura on the right, but he's going to have to sacrifice so many points to do so, and also probably keep his X. Andy can just go out anywhere else. Andy could probably play something like Laura's, L-A-U-R-A-S, from this L-A on the E column, and that would be more than enough to win against anything Steve might try to do that blocks Sura. And there's just no other play for Steve that nets more than Lax. He can score more by playing Add in the bottom right corner. That's 29 points. Lax is only 20. But then the problem, of course, is he still has the X on his rack. And the X alone is going to give Andy 8 times 2 or 16 points after he goes out. And I'll let you guys do the math. It's not hard to see that Sura still wins comfortably for Andy by even more than the 10 points he won by after Steve's play of Lax. So there you have it, guys. Weep is the winning play for Andy, and according to Quackle's championship player, it is indeed the only winning play for Andy in this position. There is absolutely nothing Steve can do after Weep. And you guys might think the story ends there. After all, the computer says Weep is Andy's only win, so that's that, right? Well, you couldn't be more wrong. This story is very much far from over. Andy did not play Weep in the original position. Instead of that, he played WAP next to the Y and O and Yod for 23 points. And you might think, wait a minute, we looked at Paw earlier in that same spot, which scores 2 more points, and it seems like they basically do the exact same thing. Isn't Steve just going to play Axion and win by 2 more points than he won by in the earlier variant? Well, let's take a look. If Steve plays Axion, then Andy now has a massive outplay down the H column. He can play Opus for 31 points, making 3 overlaps of Ao, Pei, and Upo. He can also play Onus in this spot. And is that enough? Yes, it is. That would bring Andy to 369. He gets the 8 additional points from Steve's unplayed tiles, and Andy wins by 4, 377 to 373. So now you might think, okay, wait a minute. Well, we know WAP still loses, right? Because Quackle didn't find it as a win, so Steve must have a better play than Axion. Well, you might think, okay, then he should probably just block Andy's highest scoring outplay by far, which, as I said, is Opus or Onus. And he can do that pretty well. He can play Axe with Apo, which scores 23 points, blocks that spot, and also gets rid of his high scoring X. This would put Steve up by 27 points, 365 to 338. And now Andy can go out with the same play we've been talking about for quite a while. He can play Sure or Sura on the right-hand side of the board for 19 points. And now he gets 10 points from Steve's unplayed tiles because Steve has a 2-pointer and 3 1-pointers. So Andy wins by 2, 367 to 365. So now you're like, okay, wait a minute. We know Steve can't just outrun with Axion, and he can't block with Axe, so what can he do? It doesn't help him to play Add over here because he gets a lot of points. He gets 31, but now he's going to get caught with the X. Andy again just goes out on the right and is going to win because Andy now gets 24 points from Steve's tiles and Andy wins by 8. So what can Steve do then? It turns out, guys, the answer is actually nothing. WAP does win for Andy, and this is a very bizarre bug in the Quackle program where Quackle simply did not generate WAP as a choice. It's not that hard to see, like I said, that Steve has no win here. We know Axion, which is by far his best play in terms of purely scoring as many points immediately while getting rid of as many points from his rack. We see that loses. We see that his best block of Axe loses. There's just nothing else to consider. And indeed, if you ask Quackle in this position now from Steve's perspective, Quackle, as you can see, does confirm that Steve is indeed winless. So for some reason, the Quackle engine is deep enough to see that now Steve can't win, but is not deep enough to generate WAP as an option on Andy's turn. So extremely bizarre stuff. And for the records, Andy did play this, which, by the way, kudos to Andy on finding this. Like I said, not at all easy, especially with 2 blanks and to see the possibility of the Opus or Onus overlap and that it can't really be blocked. Really, really impressive stuff. And it turns out that Steve was very, very low on time in this position. He didn't actually see Axion as a possibility. He ended up playing Ad in the bottom right corner for 29 points, and then Andy, of course, went out with Opus as originally planned for 31 and would go on to win the game by a final score of 393 to 371. So once again, major kudos to Andy on finding this winning sequence, which is one of, we now know at least 2 possible winning sequences, and major kudos as well to any of my viewers who were able to find one of these sequences, or for that matter, possibly a third sequence that I didn't even cover in this video that wins. With Quackle only finding 1 win and Andy finding another, it's certainly not outside the realm of possibilities that there is a third win. I personally have not been able to find it, but that does not mean it's not there. So if any of you think you found a third winning sequence, then please, by all means, do let me know in the comment section, and I will gladly take a look. I've put back the original position here in case any of you want to take a closer look and see if you can find a third or possibly even more than a third winning sequence for Andy here. Like I said, please let me know if you are able to succeed. And that's going to about do it for this video, but once again, major shout out to Andy, not only on winning this really, really cool endgame, but also on sending it to me to feature in a video. Really appreciate it, and as always, if you guys have any cool positions, endgames, or whatever that you think might be good for a video, feel free to email them to me and send them my way. Always love seeing what you guys come up with. So yeah, that's it for this one, guys. Like I said, really appreciate all the support. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next one. Bye-bye.